In September 1976, a Soviet pilot defected to Japan with a MiG-25, the most feared aircraft in the world. What American engineers discovered inside would change everything they thought they knew about their enemy. If you're fascinated by Cold War history and technological espionage, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories. The morning of September 6, 1976, started like any other at Hakodate Airport in northern Japan. Ground crews prepared for routine commercial flights. Maintenance workers checked equipment, and air traffic controllers monitored their radar screens with practiced efficiency. Then, at 11:42 a.m. local time, an unidentified aircraft appeared on their scopes, descending rapidly from an impossible altitude. The controller on duty, a 38-year-old veteran named Takashi Yamamoto, felt his heart rate spike as he watched the blip drop from 70,000 feet at a speed that defied everything he knew about aircraft performance. He reached for the emergency phone with trembling hands, his voice barely steady as he reported what he was seeing. Within minutes, the sleek, angular form of a MiG-25 Foxbat touched down on the civilian runway, its massive engines still screaming as the pilot brought the aircraft to a stop. The Soviet pilot who emerged from the cockpit, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, carried with him not just his flight suit and survival gear, but the keys to one of the Cold War's most closely guarded secrets. In Washington, the call came through to CIA headquarters at 3 a.m. Eastern Time. James Henderson, a 45-year-old senior intelligence analyst who had spent 2 decades studying Soviet military technology, was jolted awake by his bedside phone. His wife, Sarah, stirred beside him as he fumbled for the receiver in the darkness of their Georgetown bedroom. The voice on the other end belonged to his supervisor, and the words made Henderson sit bolt upright, suddenly wide awake. A Soviet pilot had defected to Japan with a MiG-25, and the Japanese government was willing to let American specialists examine the aircraft. Henderson's hands shook as he switched on the bedside lamp, his mind already racing through the implications. For years, Western intelligence had feared the Foxbat as an unstoppable interceptor capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3 and altitudes where no American aircraft could follow. Now, incredibly, they would have the chance to see inside the legend. Sarah watched her husband dress in the pre-dawn darkness, her face etched with concern. They had been married for 23 years, and she knew that look in his eyes. This was the moment his entire career had been building toward. Henderson kissed her goodbye at the front door of their brick colonial home, promising to call when he could, knowing it might be weeks before he returned. The cherry trees lining their street were already beginning to turn with the first hints of autumn, their leaves rustling in the cool September breeze as he climbed into the waiting government car. During the drive to Andrews Air Force Base, Henderson reviewed everything he knew about the MiG-25 from classified intelligence reports. The Foxbat had first appeared in Soviet service in 1970, and its performance capabilities had terrified NATO planners. American fighter pilots spoke of it in hushed, almost reverent tones. The State Route 71 Blackbird, America's fastest aircraft, could outrun most threats, but the MiG-25 could actually chase it down. Or so everyone believed. The CIA assembled a team of 12 specialists for the mission. They converged on Andrews from across the country, each bringing unique expertise in aeronautics, metallurgy, avionics, or propulsion systems. Robert Chun, a 32-year-old materials engineer from MIT who had been consulting for the agency for 3 years, arrived at the airfield carrying 2 large equipment cases and a sense of barely contained excitement. His parents had fled mainland China in 1949, and he had grown up hearing stories about the threat of communist expansion. Now, he would help uncover the secrets of one of communism's most advanced weapons. Margaret Sullivan, a 40-year-old avionics specialist who had helped design guidance systems for American fighters, sat quietly during the briefing aboard the military transport, mentally cataloging everything she hoped to examine. Her teenage son had joined the Air Force against her wishes the previous year, and she thought about him constantly, wondering if he might one day face these aircraft in combat. The flight to Japan took 14 hours, with a refueling stop in Alaska. Henderson used the time to brief his team on the diplomatic situation. The Japanese government was caught in a delicate position. He explained they wanted to maintain relations with Moscow, but also understood the intelligence value of what had literally fallen into their lap. The Soviets were already demanding the immediate return of both pilot and aircraft, issuing increasingly threatening diplomatic notes. Tokyo had agreed to let the Americans examine the MiG-25, but everything had to be done quietly, and time was limited. The aircraft would need to be disassembled, studied, and returned to Soviet control within weeks. Every hour would count. During the refueling stop in Anchorage, Henderson stood in the cold Alaskan air, watching ground crews service their aircraft under bright floodlights. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath formed clouds in the darkness. He thought about the generations of intelligence officers who had worked to understand Soviet capabilities, the countless hours spent analyzing grainy photographs and intercepted communications, trying to piece together accurate assessments from fragments of information. Now, they had the real thing, an actual MiG-25, and the responsibility to extract every possible insight weighed heavily on his shoulders. Robert Chun joined him on the tarmac, stamping his feet against the cold, and they discussed their approach to the materials analysis. Chun planned to start with non-destructive testing using X-rays and ultrasound to map the internal structure before taking any samples. Every decision had to balance the need for information against the requirement to return the aircraft intact. Margaret Sullivan used the flight time to review technical manuals on Soviet avionics systems, comparing what was known from other sources with what they might find in the Foxbat. She had brought a portable tape recorder and planned to dictate detailed observations as she worked, creating a permanent record that could be transcribed and analyzed later. Her methodical approach reflected years of experience in technical intelligence, where thoroughness often mattered more than speed. The younger engineers on the team watched her preparations with respect, recognizing a professional at the peak of her capabilities. She caught their glances and smiled, remembering her own early days in defense work when she had been the youngest person in rooms full of experienced specialists, fighting to prove herself in a male-dominated field. They landed at Chitose Air Base near Sapporo on September 8th, stepping off the transport in a cold rain that soaked through their jackets within minutes. The base commander, a Japanese colonel who spoke excellent English, met them personally, his face grave as he outlined the security arrangements. The MiG-25 had been moved to a hangar under heavy guard, completely isolated from the rest of the base. No photographs were permitted by unauthorized personnel, and Japanese intelligence officers would monitor the American team at all times. Henderson nodded his understanding, his eyes already scanning toward the distant hangar where the most advanced Soviet interceptor ever built waited in the shadows. The first sight of the MiG-25 took Henderson's breath away. The aircraft dominated the hangar, its angular fuselage stretching nearly 70 feet from nose to tail, its twin vertical stabilizers rising like monuments above the concrete floor. Even sitting motionless, stripped of weapons and with its engines cold, the Foxbat radiated menace. Henderson approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, reaching out to touch the aircraft's skin with something approaching reverence. The metal felt cold beneath his fingertips, its surface showing wear from high-altitude flight. Behind him, his team spread out, each specialist moving toward their area of focus with practiced efficiency. The real work was about to begin. Robert Chin started with the airframe structure, using portable X-ray equipment to examine welds and joints while taking careful measurements of every component. What he found in those first hours contradicted everything Western intelligence had assumed. The MiG-25 skin was not constructed from titanium or advanced composite materials as expected. Instead, the Soviets had built their Mach 3 interceptor primarily from welded steel alloys. Chun ran his gloved hand along a fuselage panel, his mind struggling to process the implications. Steel was heavy, far heavier than the materials American engineers would have chosen for a high-speed aircraft. Yet, the MiG-25 flew faster than almost anything in Western arsenals. He pulled out his portable spectrometer and began analyzing the metal composition, documenting percentages of nickel, chromium, and other elements that gave the alloy its heat-resistant properties. The readings were precise, methodical, unremarkable in themselves, but in aggregate, they told a story about Soviet engineering philosophy that was completely unexpected. Margaret Sullivan climbed into the cockpit on the third day, her notebook already half filled with observations about the aircraft's avionics suite. The instruments were massive compared to American standards, with vacuum tubes instead of transistors in many systems. She carefully photographed each panel, each switch, each gauge, her trained eye noting the layout and the Cyrillic labels. The radar system was less sophisticated than she had anticipated, powerful but unsophisticated in its targeting capabilities. The weapons control systems were similarly robust, but basic. As she sat in the pilot seat where Viktor Belenko had flown this machine across the Sea of Japan just days earlier, Sullivan felt a strange sense of connection to the unknown Soviet engineers who had designed these systems. They had solved the same problem she faced in her work, just with different tools, different materials, different philosophies. The result was effective in its own way, if not elegant by Western standards. The engines proved to be the biggest surprise. Two massive turbojets, each capable of producing over 24,000 pounds of thrust. They were the largest fighter engines the Americans had ever examined. But a team of propulsion specialists led by a gruff AirForce colonel named Frank Morrison discovered that the Engine's operational lifespan was shockingly short. These were not precision instruments designed for hundreds of hours of service. They were powerful, brutally simple devices meant to be replaced after relatively minimal use. Morrison stood beneath one of the engines on its maintenance stand, shaking his head in disbelief as he explained his findings to Henderson. The Soviets had accepted trade-offs that no American manufacturer would consider, prioritizing raw performance over longevity, accepting inefficiency for the sake of simplicity and ease of production. It was a completely different approach to the problem of high-speed interception. Each night, the team gathered in a secured room at their hotel to compile findings and debate implications. Henderson led these sessions, drawing connections between individual discoveries and the larger picture they revealed. The MiG-25 was not the unstoppable superweapon Western intelligence had feared. It was fast, yes, incredibly fast, and it could reach astonishing altitudes, but it was also crude in many ways, built to Soviet specifications that valued different qualities than American designs. Chun argued that the heavy steel construction actually made sense from a Soviet perspective. Steel was cheap, widely available, and Soviet metallurgists knew how to work with it. Why develop expensive titanium fabrication techniques when welded steel would serve the purpose? Sullivan pointed out that the vacuum tube electronics, while obsolete by American standards, were actually more resistant to electromagnetic pulse effects that might occur in nuclear warfare. What looked like backwardness might actually represent different priorities. The debates during these evening sessions grew heated at times as engineers with different specialties and perspectives argued about what their findings meant. A young propulsion specialist from Pratt & Whitney insisted that the MiG-25's engines represented a fundamentally flawed approach, sacrificing longevity for short-term performance gains that no rational designer would accept. But Frank Morrison, the Air Force colonel, pushed back forcefully. The Soviets were not irrational, he argued. They had made conscious choices based on their operational requirements and industrial capabilities. A Soviet interceptor needed to scramble quickly, climb rapidly to intercept high-altitude bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, and return to base. If the engines only lasted 100 hours instead of 1,000, that might be acceptable if it meant having more aircraft in service sooner, built with materials and techniques that Soviet factories could produce in quantity. The argument was not about which approach was better in absolute terms, Morrison insisted, but about understanding why each side made the choices they did. Henderson found himself questioning assumptions he had held for his entire career. The CIA and Air Force had spent billions developing countermeasures against a threat that was real, but perhaps not quite as formidable as everyone had believed. The MiG-25 was a remarkable achievement of Soviet engineering, but it succeeded through brute force rather than elegant sophistication. It was fast because it had enormous fuel-hungry engines and an airframe designed to withstand extreme heat through mass rather than advanced materials. It could reach high altitudes because those same powerful engines could push its heavy frame into the thin air where most aircraft struggle to operate. But it was not invincible. American fighters with better maneuverability, more advanced avionics, and longer-range missiles could challenge it effectively with the right tactics. The diplomatic pressure from Moscow intensified daily. Soviet officials delivered formal protests to the Japanese Foreign Ministry, demanding immediate access to both their pilot, who was requesting asylum in the United States, and their aircraft, which they insisted had been stolen. Japanese newspapers carried stories about the controversy, though details about what the Americans were actually doing in that isolated hangar remained closely guarded. Henderson received daily updates about the political situation from the embassy in Tokyo, each message making clear that their time was running short. They had perhaps another week, maybe 2 at most, before diplomatic realities would force them to stop their examination and begin the process of returning the disassembled aircraft to Soviet control. Every hour would count. The team worked around the clock, documenting everything with meticulous precision. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of pages of technical notes, material samples carefully cataloged and prepared for shipment back to American laboratories. Chin spent one memorable 18-hour session analyzing the aircraft's fuel system, discovering that it used a high-temperature fuel similar to those being developed for American strategic reconnaissance aircraft, but with subtle differences and additives that he found fascinating. Sullivan mapped out the entire electrical system, creating detailed schematics that would help American intelligence understand Soviet approaches to aircraft design for years to come. Morrison and his propulsion team carefully measured tolerances in the engine components, noting manufacturing techniques and material choices that revealed much about Soviet industrial capabilities. On September 24th, 18 days after Viktor Belenko's dramatic defection, Henderson received word that the examination had to conclude within 48 hours. The Japanese government could no longer withstand Soviet pressure, and arrangements were being made to return the aircraft. Henderson gathered his exhausted team for a final briefing, thanking them for their extraordinary work under difficult conditions. They had accomplished more in 2.5 weeks than anyone had thought possible, documenting the MiG-25 so thoroughly that American engineers will be able to recreate many of its systems from their notes alone. But Henderson also emphasized what their findings meant for the broader Cold War competition. The Soviet Union was formidable, yes, but it was not invincible. Its technology was in some ways impressive, in other ways surprisingly backward. Understanding these strengths and weaknesses was crucial for accurately assessing the military balance between East and West. The final hours in the hangar were bittersweet. The team packed their equipment, secured their documentation, and took a last look at the disassembled Foxbat spread across the hangar floor. Japanese technicians were already preparing to crate the components for return to the Soviets, following detailed instructions to ensure nothing was lost or damaged. Chun stood beside a section of wing skin he had studied for days, his hand resting on the metal one last time. This piece of steel had flown at 3 times the speed of sound, had carried a desperate man to freedom, and had revealed secrets that would influence aircraft design for decades. Now it would go back to the Soviet Union, probably to be scrapped or buried in some forgotten storage facility. Its defection an embarrassment Moscow would want to erase. The flight back to Washington carried a team transformed by their experience. They had gone to Japan expecting to find evidence of Soviet technological superiority and returned with a much more nuanced understanding. Margaret Sullivan sat next to Henderson during the long hours over the Pacific, discussing her plans to incorporate lessons from the MiG-25's electromagnetic pulse-resistant systems into future American designs. The Soviet use of older technology was not always a weakness, she argued. Sometimes it represented a different but valid solution to common problems. Henderson agreed, his mind already composing the report he would present to senior CIA officials. The MiG-25 examination had provided invaluable intelligence, but its real value was in revealing how the Soviets thought about engineering challenges, what trade-offs they were willing to make, what resources and capabilities they possessed. Back in Washington, Henderson spent weeks writing and revising the final report. The document eventually ran to over 300 pages, with appendices containing technical specifications, material analyses, and engineering assessments from each team member. He worked from his office at Langley, often staying late into the evening, the lights of the Potomac River visible through his window as he struggled to capture not just the facts they had discovered, but their meaning for American strategy. Sarah brought him dinner some nights, sitting quietly in his office while he ate and talked through the implications of what he had learned. She had never been cleared to know details of his work, but she understood its importance, and she listened patiently to his careful, vague descriptions of the month that had changed his understanding of the Soviet threat. The report's conclusions were simultaneously reassuring and sobering. The MiG-25 was not the unstoppable interceptor Western intelligence had feared, but it was still a capable aircraft built in significant numbers by an adversary with vast industrial resources. Soviet engineers had created an effective weapon system using available materials and established manufacturing techniques, accepting limitations in some areas to achieve impressive performance in others. American aircraft designers could learn from this approach, Henderson argued. The relentless pursuit of cutting-edge technology was important, but sometimes simpler, more robust solutions had advantages that pure sophistication could not match. The key was understanding which approach was appropriate for each specific challenge. Robert Chun returned to MIT, but the knowledge he had gained in that Japanese hangar influenced his research for the rest of his career. He published papers on high-temperature alloys and manufacturing techniques that drew on his experiences without revealing classified details. His graduate students sometimes asked why he seemed so interested in what they considered old-fashioned material science, and he would smile quietly, knowing that some of the most important lessons came from understanding how others solved problems with different resources and constraints. Years later, after the Cold War ended and many documents were declassified, Chun would sometimes lecture about the MiG-25 examination, explaining to audiences of engineers and historians how the Foxbat had taught him that there was no single correct path to solving complex technical challenges. Margaret Sullivan incorporated electromagnetic pulse resistance into several classified aircraft programs, drawing directly on what she had observed in the MiG-25's electronics. She never forgot sitting in that cockpit, seeing how Soviet engineers had laid out instruments and controls for a pilot who would be flying at speeds and altitudes where mistakes meant certain death. The human factors considerations were different from American approaches, but no less thoughtful. When she eventually retired from defense work and took a teaching position at Caltech, she often told her students that respecting your adversary's engineering was not weakness, but wisdom. Understanding how and why others made different choices expanded your own capabilities as a designer and analyst. Viktor Belenko, the pilot whose defection had made the entire examination possible, was granted asylum in the United States. He settled into a new life in America, working as a consultant on Soviet aviation for various defense contractors and intelligence agencies. He rarely spoke publicly about his decision to flee the Soviet Union with a MiG-25, but in private conversations, he expressed satisfaction that his aircraft had contributed to Western understanding of Soviet capabilities. Years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, he would learn that his defection had caused significant changes in Soviet military aviation security procedures and had ended several promising careers of officers held responsible for not preventing his flight. The knowledge troubled him, but he never regretted his choice. The MiG-25 itself was returned to Soviet control in November 1976, carefully crated and shipped back across the Pacific. Soviet technicians reassembled it at a military facility outside Moscow, searching for any signs of tampering or missing components. They found the aircraft largely intact, but knew that American specialists had examined every detail. The diplomatic embarrassment of the defection was compounded by the knowledge that the West now understood the Foxbat's capabilities and limitations far better than before. Soviet designers began work on improved versions, incorporating upgrades meant to address the vulnerabilities the examination had revealed. The technological competition continued, each side learning from the other, each development prompting counter-developments in an endless cycle of action and reaction. Henderson's career advanced steadily in the years following the MiG-25 examination. He led other intelligence analysis projects, briefed presidents and senior military commanders, and trained a new generation of analysts. But he always considered those weeks in Japan to be the highlight of his professional life. The experience had taught him that intelligence work was not just about gathering secrets, but about understanding how others thought, what priorities they held, what resources they could bring to bear. The MiG-25 had been built by engineers working under Soviet conditions with Soviet materials, following Soviet design philosophies. It was a window into a society Americans spent enormous resources trying to understand, and Henderson never forgot the lessons of looking through that window. The hangar in Japan, where the examination took place, returned to normal operations after the Americans left, housing routine maintenance on Japanese military aircraft. No plaques marked what had occurred there, no public acknowledgement of the historical significance of those weeks in September and October of 1976. The ground crews and maintenance workers who had been stationed elsewhere during the examination returned to find their workspace unchanged. Only a few senior officers knew what secrets had been revealed in that building, what understanding had been gained about an adversary's capabilities through painstaking technical analysis and years of accumulated expertise. James Henderson retired from the CIA in 1991, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. He watched the news coverage of Moscow's final days with mixed emotions. The enemy he had spent his career studying was disintegrating, its threat evaporating as political and economic realities overwhelmed ideology. Part of him felt vindicated. The intensive analysis of Soviet capabilities had shown that the threat, while real, was manageable with proper understanding and preparation. But another part of him felt a strange sense of loss. The Cold War competition had driven innovation and discovery, had pushed both sides to remarkable achievements. Whatever came after would be different, perhaps less clear-cut, certainly more complex. In the final years of his life, Henderson sometimes drove past Andrews Air Force Base, thinking about that September morning when he had boarded a military transport bound for Japan. He had been 45 then, at the height of his career, facing an opportunity that comes perhaps once in a lifetime for an intelligence analyst. He had returned from Japan with knowledge that influenced American military planning for years, that helped ensure American pilots would not be surprised or overwhelmed by Soviet technology. But more than that, he had returned with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the Cold War competition, for the different paths to achieving military capability, for the importance of respecting your adversary's strengths while understanding their weaknesses. The story of the MiG-25 examination remained classified for decades, with only hints appearing in public discussions of Cold War aviation. Gradual declassification eventually revealed more details, allowing historians and aviation enthusiasts to appreciate the full significance of Viktor Belenko's defection and the American technical analysis it enabled. The examination had been a masterpiece of intelligence exploitation conducted under difficult diplomatic circumstances by a small team of dedicated specialists who understood that their opportunity was fleeting and irreplaceable. They had made the most of every hour, documenting a remarkable aircraft and revealing secrets that shaped the military balance between superpowers. Robertson never forgot running a spectrometer over that steel-wing skin and realizing that the most feared interceptor in the Soviet arsenal was built from what Western engineers considered an obsolete material. The discovery had been humbling and enlightening. There was brilliance in the Soviet approach, a willingness to work with available resources and accept trade-offs that American designers would not consider. The MiG-25 was not elegant by Western standards, but it was effective for its intended purpose, and that effectiveness came from a clear-eyed assessment of requirements and capabilities, not from blind adherence to technological fashion. Chun tried to bring that lesson into his own work, to always question assumptions about what materials or approaches were appropriate for each challenge. Margaret Sullivan's grandchildren sometimes asked her about the Cold War, trying to understand the world their grandmother had lived and worked in. She found it difficult to explain the constant tension the sense that miscalculation could lead to catastrophe, the weight of responsibility felt by everyone working on defense systems that might determine national survival. But she always emphasized that the Cold War had also been a time of remarkable achievement when brilliant people on both sides had pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The MiG-25, she told them, was a perfect example. Soviet engineers had created an aircraft capable of speeds and altitudes that seemed impossible using materials and methods that many Western experts would have dismissed. They had been wrong to dismiss. And that lesson about respecting others' capabilities while maintaining your own strengths was one she hoped her grandchildren would remember. The veterans of the MiG-25 examination stayed in touch over the years, gathering occasionally to reminisce about those intense weeks in Japan. They had shared something special, a moment when all their training and expertise had come together to accomplish something of genuine historical importance. Henderson always hosted these gatherings at his house in Georgetown, Sarah preparing dinner while the old colleagues swapped stories and discussed how their experiences had influenced subsequent careers. Some had gone on to examine other foreign aircraft and systems, but none of those later projects had quite the same impact as the Foxbat. It had been the right aircraft at the right time, providing answers to questions that shaped strategic planning at the highest levels. The intelligence gained from the MiG-25 examination influenced American aircraft development for the next 2 decades. Designers at Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas incorporated lessons about trade-offs between speed, maneuverability, and systems complexity. The Soviet willingness to accept limited engine life and crude avionics in exchange for raw performance taught American engineers that there was no universal solution to aircraft design challenges. Different requirements demanded different approaches, and sometimes the most sophisticated technology was not the most appropriate for a given mission. These insights shaped fighters like the F-15 and F-16, aircraft that balanced multiple capabilities rather than pursuing any single performance parameter to the exclusion of others. When the Cold War ended and former Soviet engineers began appearing at Western aviation conferences, some of the Americans who had examined the MiG-25 had opportunities to meet the men who had designed it. These encounters were often emotional, former adversaries finding common ground in their shared passion for aviation and engineering. The Soviet designers were sometimes surprised to learn how thoroughly their aircraft had been analyzed, how much the Americans had deduced from examining the physical hardware. But they also took pride in their creation's achievements in having built an effective interceptor that served Soviet air defense needs for decades. The MiG-25 had been exactly what it needed to be, they insisted, even if it did not match Western aesthetic preferences for elegant solutions. James Henderson died in 2008 at the age of 77. His obituary in the Washington Post made brief mention of his CIA career, but revealed few details of his work. At his funeral, several former colleagues spoke about his contributions to American national security, carefully avoiding specifics, but making clear that his analyses had influenced important decisions during critical periods. Sarah Henderson found among her husband's papers a worn notebook from September 1976, filled with observations about Soviet engineering philosophy and the lessons of the MiG-25 examination. She donated it to the CIA Museum, where it joined other artifacts from the long twilight struggle between East and West. The hangar in Japan stands today much as it did in 1976, still housing aircraft maintenance and repair operations for Japan's self-defense forces. Younger personnel working there have no idea of the building's place in Cold War history, of the days when American specialists carefully documented every detail of a defector's aircraft while diplomats argued about its return. The concrete floors have been repaired and repainted many times, erasing any physical traces of the MiG-25's brief presence. But the knowledge gained in that building influenced events far beyond northern Japan, shaping understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions at a crucial moment in the superpower competition. The story of the MiG-25 examination is ultimately about how knowledge shapes policy, how technical understanding can reduce fear and enable rational decision-making. Before Viktor Belenko's defection, Western planners had feared the Foxbat as an unstoppable threat, a symbol of Soviet technological prowess that seemed to portend dangerous military imbalances. After the examination, American officials understood that while the MiG-25 was formidable, it was not invincible. This understanding allowed for more measured assessments of the military balance, less panic about supposed Soviet advantages, and more confidence in American capabilities to compete effectively. The truth carefully documented in that Japanese hangar was more complex and more manageable than the fears it replaced. The lessons of the MiG-25 examination extended far beyond aviation. They illuminated how the Soviet system approached complex technological challenges, what trade-offs Soviet planners were willing to accept, what their industrial capabilities could achieve. This understanding proved valuable across many domains of Cold War competition, from strategic weapons to space systems to conventional military forces. The Foxbat had been a window into Soviet decision-making, and looking through that window carefully had revealed patterns that helped American planners anticipate and respond to Soviet actions in other areas. Intelligence work was ultimately about reducing uncertainty, about replacing speculation with knowledge, and the MiG-25 examination had done exactly that at a crucial moment. Today, the MiG-25's significance is recognized by aviation historians and Cold War scholars as a turning point in Western understanding of Soviet military technology. The aircraft itself has been retired from most services, replaced by more modern designs that incorporate advances in materials, electronics, and propulsion. But its influence persists in the lessons learned from its examination, in the approaches to intelligence analysis those lessons reinforced, and in the careers shaped by participation in one of the Cold War's most successful technical intelligence operations. The steel-skinned interceptor that landed at Hakodate Airport on that September morning in 1976 carried more than just a desperate pilot seeking freedom. It carried secrets that would help define the remaining years of the superpower competition, knowledge gained through painstaking analysis by dedicated professionals who understood that understanding your adversary was the first step toward managing conflict without catastrophe.